Having our garden and growing our own food was actually one of the main reasons we decided to move to the countryside. When we arrived, we thought we were ready for everything that we had to do, but it turns out we weren't. The first thing we did wasn't planting, it was actually walking around and observing the land. For the first couple of days, we spent a lot of time moving around the land, trying to understand how it was shaped, where it slopes, and where water naturally flows, which areas get more sun and which ones stay cooler. We looked closely at the trees that were already here. Some were planted years ago and others had grown wild.
We started asking ourselves simple questions. Which trees are healthy? Which trees are sick? Which ones should stay and which ones should go? Even though our intention to observe was strong, time passed quickly, and the urge to test and experiment slowly knocked at our door. So we tried our first gardening experiment by placing the vegetable garden on this side of the land. We took some rough measurements and imagined where things could go. Without overthinking it too much. But things struggled to germinate and grow. Over time, we realized this area was actually better suited for something else, a food forest. But we will tell that story in another video.
What stayed very clear, though, was that we had made a few mistakes. The first one was rushing. We sowed seeds before really understanding the soil and the local climate. Then heavy rains came, and many of the seeds we planted either rotted or were washed away. We needed more time and actually more observation. Another mistake was placing the garden too far from the house. It made it harder to check on it regularly. At the same time, we didn't manage the wild grasses and plants well enough, and they quickly took over the vegetables.
All of this became part of the learning. But this also taught us one important thing. Before changing the land, we should be listening to it. We realized two important things. First, observation doesn't stop once you begin. It continues through every mistake. And second, the garden needed to be somewhere else, closer to the house. With this shot, we want to show you the contrast between two systems. On the left, our neighbor's garden, a more traditional approach where the soil is tilled to remove weeds and prepare beds. At this moment, as you can see, the soil looks dry and sandy. On the right instead, a lush green space, where succession and native plants are building healthier soil and stronger biodiversity. The choice felt clear. We wanted to follow nature's principle, so we opted for a regenerative and no-till gardening system.
So we started studying and then observing again. As we walked around, we began noticing what was already thriving on its own. Plants like the stinging nettle and the wild mint. They are often seen as weeds, but actually they're great indicators of soil health and biodiversity. Once we understood both the potential and the constraints of the land, we went back to the drawing board, well, actually to our laptop. Using drone images, we started mapping out the garden. First, the paths, then the area for growing the vegetables, and finally, based on what we learned from books and observation, the size of the beds and their orientation in relation to the sun. Slowly, the idea of our future garden started to take shape. And that's when the real work could begin.
With our design finally on paper, we started working the garden and preparing the space. Before anything else, we had to deal with the fruit trees. They were really big. Most of them had been abandoned for around 10 years, so they had grown very tall, dense, and super messy. Because of that, they weren't producing much, and a lot of the fruit was rotting before it could properly ripen. The canopy was simply too dense and air couldn't flow through.
It was our first time doing most of this work, so we did things slowly and learned as we went. We were also pretty nervous the first time we used the chainsaw. It's a powerful tool, so we took our time and stayed very careful, especially in the beginning. After pruning, we started organizing all the branches. The thinner ones were grouped together so we could chip them and use them in our Johnson Su compost system, and we'll tell you more about that in another video. Or as mulch for the pathways between the garden beds. The thicker branches, which our small electric wood chipper couldn't handle, were saved for the campfire or used to define beds and paths.
Once the garden was cleared of all branches, we started measuring and mapping out the vegetable beds. We removed the grass in those areas and then used a grilling net to gently aerate the soil. Just enough to help it breathe without disturbing its ecosystem, following the principles of no-till and regenerative gardening.
And then came the manure. We got it from a neighbor who kindly brought a full truckload to our place. Moving it and spreading it across 20 beds took a lot more time and energy than we expected. It was days of work, but it was necessary to bring in nutrients and help restart the soil biology in a land that had been neglected for a long time. Manure is something we use very carefully. It's very rich in nutrients, and on already healthy soil, it can be too much. In our case, the land needed support, so we used it once before planting in spring. Our goal is not to rely on it in the future, but we'll see how the soil responds.
After spreading it, we covered the beds. This helps retain moisture, allows the manure to break down slowly, and prevents grasses from growing back, leaving the beds ready for planting. And then we waited. But in the meantime, we started growing a few seeds, and much more.